Hello, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for joining us. It's been such a fascinating few days talking about many different areas of trust and also the correlate of mistrust. And we've seen that this form of mistrust exists in multiple different domains. We talk about trust in government and public institutions, also about how we trust in each other and in society, and how our societies are divided and how we can overcome it. And also how governments trust or do not trust in their people, and what we can do to try and transform that to create more cohesive, more harmonious societies where people can thrive and feel empowered. I want to take us to the international system. I work on international relations and international security, and we've seen in recent years the number of challenges that we have faced within that space. The current conflict in Ukraine, the recent pandemic, real challenges in Sudan, in the Yemen, and also economic inequality that we see at an international level affecting different countries disproportionately. And this is a huge topic, and I have 10 minutes, so I hope you won't mind that it might be a little bit of a whiz through some of the core themes, and I'm really happy to then answer any questions at the end. And what I want to focus on is the potential of empathy to overcome mistrust. And as we've spoken about in some of the sessions, this idea of mistrust and distrust can actually be very healthy. This idea of doubt and skepticism ensures that we hold our democratic governments to account. It means that we really question what is going on here. Should I trust the sources? As Sylvia just spoke about, we need this kind of healthy mistrust in order to make sure that we do engage properly with society, that we know who to trust and where we need to be careful in order to protect and ensure our vulnerabilities are not exploited. And the international system is characterized by mistrust, in part because in international relations we talk about this anarchical system. There is no one world government. There is no universal rule that people follow and you can trust that everyone is going to do it. There are certain norms, there are certain standards of behavior that we expect other states and people to adhere to, but actually it's very much a complex, complicated environment in which anything can happen, in which states can invade other states and feel impunity at their potential to do so. It's also an area that's characterized by insecurity, conflict, pandemics, like I've said, and these challenges can heighten mistrust, which in turn can increase insecurity. And part of the reason can be dependent on the leadership that we see at an international level, at a national level, at the capacity of people to handle these crises in a way that shows integrity and courage and honesty and genuine leadership. And unfortunately, we don't always get that, which increases our level of mistrust in the people leading. And in international relations, when dealing with other countries, you don't know what they are thinking. And this is really why I'm fascinated in empathy. When the United States is talking about China, it can assume that it knows. But often when we talk about other countries, it's based on projections, on stereotypes, and ideas of who they are and what they think and what they're planning to do. And we talk often in international relations of the security dilemma. So because a state does not know what the other state thinks and what it's doing, it fears its intention. And fear is one of these critical mobilizing forces within the field, within the international environment. Because you fear what the other might do, that they might want to invade you, they might want to harm you, they might want to use violence or exploit you. You then start to build up your defenses. You then start to increase your security measures in order to protect against possible violation or a possible attack. And the problem then is that the other side sees those actions as a source of fear and aggression too. So they equally start to increase their defense spending and their armaments. And they also then start to fear for the worst. So you get what is called a security dilemma and a spiral of increasing insecurity, increasing uncertainty. And so when you view events through this lens, without a more nuanced and complex picture of what's really going on, and without a genuine understanding of what the other side means, and in this context I'm talking in quite an abstract general sense without talking about any one state in particular, you then anticipate the worst. And that can be a very important thing to do. Mistrust is very healthy. It ensures deterrence. It ensures you make sure that your borders and your people are protected, that you have adequate security measures in place, whether that's to protect your critical national infrastructure, to protect your population. But we can do more to try and ensure that what we avoid is a misinterpretation of the threat. And people who've been writing about empathy for years, people such as Ralph K. White, and also, fascinatingly, the former Secretary of Defense in the United States, Robert McNamara, speak of how empathy is one of the key routes to try and overcome this. And I realize you've just not seen this slide. I'm so sorry I've been talking about this without this slide up. And so how do we start to use a greater understanding of the international system, a greater understanding of what people are going through is a way to try and reduce insecurity? How do we break that cycle? And when we're talking about this, I could talk about the United States and China, I could talk about the current conflict with Russia, but I want to talk more about the broader challenges that we face in the international system and the calls for change that we are seeing from civil society, from other states, and from citizens. Because we don't often talk about how mistrust in the international system can cause problems beyond the conflicts that we see, can cause problems for the very fabric of the international workings of the United Nations, of the way states internationally engage and interact with one another. And there are increasingly calls for change. Barbadian Prime Minister Mia Mottley has spoken frequently in the international system about this need to transform how we think about equality, how we think about who has a voice within the system and who does not. And it was striking as well that during one of his first interviews with the United Nations, President Zelensky spoke about how can we change this system that enables one power to perform this act of aggression against another state and they can get away with it. So how then do we start to think about the very international system differently? And this is what I'm working on in one of the books, is what can we do to change the system, to bring in more voices, to try and transform the way in which we respond to crises. During the pandemic, as again, Mia Mottley and others pointed out, there was a disproportionate allocation of vaccines to the global north. A huge number of countries in Africa and Latin America and others did not get access to the medicine that they needed, the vaccines they needed to protect their citizens against the outbreak. In terms of financial inequality, we see that wealth is distributed incredibly unequally across countries around the world. And this has disproportionate impact on those who live in the poorest countries, who are often providing low, unskilled labor at very poor cost with little support. But it also means that the wealth itself is distributed in a very unequal way. And Mia Mottley again has proposed this new Bridgetown agenda, trying to think about how can we do this. And other states are also calling for change. They want to see a reform of the United Nations Security Council, for example, which currently only has 5 seats. They want to see more seats represented. They want to see a diversity of views. When we think about climate change, a huge amount of the appeals for change in that domain are led by small states and island nations, those who are really at the forefront of the climate crisis, but so often because of their geopolitical location, because of the power they have in the international space, they're not accorded the same power and they're not accorded the same voice and listened to with the same credibility. So one of the keys that I think to move from this, and I talk a lot in my work about a shift from power over to power with. We've lived in an international system that is very much based on large powers, the big powers. The United States, Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany dominate the agenda. But that also can mean that a very narrow agenda is represented within the international space. How do we move to more power with? And not only talking about states, but how do we do more to include citizens, civil society, non-governmental organizations within the very way we think about international relations? So empathy is one of the tools. There are many, it's not the only one, but it's one that I think deserves greater attention. And it involves an attempt and an effort to understand the lived experiences and perspectives of others. And it's understanding not only their interests and motivations. We often talk very much about rationality and interests and very clear-cut, quantifiable measures of what a state thinks. But actually, what are their experiences? What is their identity? How do they think about themselves and others? How do they make meanings? How do they use symbols? And how then can they recognize themselves? How do they engage with others? And there's a tendency within international conflict to dehumanize and demonize the other and ascribe to them the worst traits and qualities and intentions. But empathy says, what if we start to try and understand states as they understand themselves as a way to then have a greater dialogue with them? And critical to this is also self-reflection, is understanding how states are seen by others. What have they done in the world that maybe means that some other states don't trust them, that maybe means that they're not seen as credible actors, they're not seen as effective arbiters in certain conflicts or in certain situations, they're not seen as guaranteeing the rights that they say they are. And so it's a process and a practice and a mindset, and a huge part of doing it. When I talk about empathy, it's often within governments, within the kind of strategy-making, decision-making process. How much are they understood? But also, how are different states and different people spoken about in national media, in popular culture, in the way in which we engage and understand different people? And so rebuilding trust is then a process, and it takes effort and credible signals of intention. So by using empathy as a means, by saying, we're trying to understand you, we're trying to listen to what you say, and when we think about the climate crisis, if larger states are able to say, we'll really want to listen to what this means for small states and island nations who are going to affect it, how can we help? What is needed? What can be done to transform this? What are the credible steps that need to be taken in order to change it? It can help to then signal that process of rebuilding trust, because a lot of these countries no longer trust these large states to protect them and look after their interests. And this is particularly evident when we think about, as well, some of the votes in the United Nations on Ukraine, where a lot of nations that maybe European and American states thought would be allies either abstained or were a little bit hesitant about supporting measures. And a huge part of this is in diplomacy. It's in ensuring that there are people who can build interpersonal relations, who can represent different states and represent their interests accurately back to their headquarters, to really engage in the dialogues and the conversations to understand people. But one of the challenges is that diplomacy is less valued. We often see cuts in diplomacy. We tend to see a prioritization of defensive and security measures in order to overcome the challenges we face, rather than this effort to dialogue. And it's interesting to see that just this week, new talks were announced between the United States and China as a way to try and rebuild some of that relationship between them, to rebuild some of that trust and some of that relationship that's been lost with the increasing kind of hostility in the narratives on both sides towards each other and towards their intention. So one of the ideas is really that we move towards a more global dialogue that says, how do we think about international organizations that bring more people in, that gives more representation and more accountability for all states, to really ensure that there are conversations about how the system can work better for people, to ensure access to healthcare, to ensure access to economic rights, economic livelihoods, and also to ensure representation of what happens. It's interesting when you talk to some diplomats, they'll say, well, China gives us money, but the West gives us a lecture. So moving beyond that idea of lecturing people to actually listening and understanding legacies and the importance of what they need and how they can, how we can create something that fosters far more engagement and coexistence in a space that requires collective solutions to global challenges. Climate change will require collective approaches to find adequate solutions. And I'm not naive enough, I know that I'm given a kind of very quick overview of these ideas, I'm not naive enough to assume this is an easy process, but by actually having far more conversations about reforming international organizations, reforming the ways in which we listen to different people, and actually ensuring that we create channels of dialogue, even if they're back channel behind closed doors, as a way to try and build up those elements of trust. It will help us to then try and address some of the conflicts we face, if not immediately, then in the longer term. And especially, sorry, I should take a moment. And And I think this idea of coexistence, this idea of trying to understand what different people need and finding mutual ownership in the outcomes, playing to different strengths of different countries and empowering more people to create more shared investments and collective responsibilities is the only real way that we're going to be able to face the challenges of climate change, of a future pandemic. And bringing that into how we design policies, how we design strategies, and how we engage as well at a cultural level in people-to-people exchange, in working with others from different countries to try and understand how they are at a very local level. Because that's one of the ways that we really work to overcome mistrust, is that we challenge the stereotypes we hear from the media by knowing people ourselves, knowing that these accounts are not the true story. They're often reductive, they're often stereotypical, and that by engaging more with people through exchange, we get to see the more complex and nuanced reality behind it. I realize this is a really quick whiz through all of these ideas, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time, and I'm really happy to answer any questions.
Claire Yorke, thank you so much. While you're preparing your questions, you can take this microphone, perfect. I just want to go back one more time on the naive thing. While I was preparing for the panel, I was meeting a friend. He's a professor for international relations, quite in a conservative way of looking at things and seeing it mainly as a power struggle and power game. And especially in the light of Russia's attack on Ukraine and Putin's apparent, cold-bloodedness, a pledge for more empathy in international relations could be perceived as a bit naive and out of touch. What is your response on that skepticism? So I can go back to him.
Yeah, no, I actually got this question yesterday as well, because it's true. It does seem to not make sense to advocate this idea of empathy at a time when we're facing this horrific conflict in Ukraine and also other conflicts that are going on. But actually, this idea of empathy can be quite strategic. So there's this concept of strategic empathy, of really understanding how other people work as a way to design better policies. If you don't understand Russia at all, if you only demonize and create this kind of image of it that doesn't understand the nuances behind the scenes, you can't design policies to then counter what they're doing. And so you see empathy discussed in work on propaganda during the Second World War, and they would advocate empathy as a way to beat the Nazis. Because if you didn't understand the Nazis, you couldn't then understand how to tailor your message in order to win over the population. And I think it's creating that difference between having everybody have empathy, and having people within government at a strategic level trying to understand what's really going on, and using it diplomatically, using the back channels and the connections and the relations.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Now it's up to you. Maybe we'll get a little bit more light in the audience again. Who wants to raise a question and catch the green ball? You're very shy this morning. Thank you so much. Again, more in the back row.
Hello. How do you create empathy with someone who doesn't want to be empathic? And how do you overcome the idea of the adversary?
Yes. So it's this idea of, with strategic empathy, is using it as a tool within strategy making and government. So you use different levers in order to understand different countries, to then inform policy making. But you're right, you can encounter these resistances in empathy, that people will just see it. There's a danger it's seen as a weakness, but actually good empathy has boundaries, and it should be seen as a strength, as in something that acknowledges the limitations as well of the situation and communicates more clearly about what is possible and what is not.
In Germany, we currently have a feminist foreign policy. Do you think there lies a special opportunity in the correlation between maybe a feminist look on things and empathy?
I mean, the feminist foreign policy is very much rooted in this idea of understanding different experiences and their voices, especially of women and people of all genders, and bringing that into understanding. So absolutely, I think it's got empathy at the heart of what it does.
Last chance for your questions. Yeah, over there.
Thanks. Traditionally, I think that a lot of sort of efforts to understand the behavior of other states tends to rely on secret service activities. So I was wondering how, if you're trying to build a culture of empathy within the international relations scene, how you would relate that to this rather mistrust building foundational activity and engagement with other states, how that would build into the transformation you're envisioning.
Yeah, you're right, because when it's done by intelligence agencies, it can lead to more mistrust. I think it's about diplomacy, but it's also about cultural exchanges, scientific exchanges, education exchanges, ways in which more people understand different countries at a more nuanced and personal level. And so for me, a lot of the work is on diplomacy and really ensuring you have people who speak languages, who are able to be embedded within countries for long enough to understand and get to know it beyond the bubble of a capital, so they get out into the country itself to understand it more broadly and feed that back into the national strategy, design and development.
Understanding more languages, the Goethe-Institut very much is like that. So my last question. Do you believe in a steady evolution of humanity? So will politics and international relations be more determined by empathy in 50 or 100 years? It's your chance on an optimistic outlook now.
Yeah, I'm realistic about the challenges we face, but I'm also optimistic. I talk to a lot of citizens organizations, civil society organizations, diplomats, leaders who want to see a change. And I think it's important that we have the very different conversations about the future of AI, about the future of the environment, about how we engage with each other and foster healthy democracies. And the very fact we're having that, because we realize we can't continue, is in itself an important prospect and opportunity for the future.
Thank you so much. Claire Yorke, everyone. Thank you.